My name is Laura. I am 37 years old. I live in a small town called Maplewood, somewhere between the mountains and a river that changes color depending on the season. In autumn, it looks almost copper. In winter, it goes gray. I have always thought rivers are honest that way. They don't pretend to be something they aren't. I have 2 children. My husband is Thomas. He is 42. We have been married for 14 years. I want to tell you about those 14 years. Not just the ending, but the beginning too. Because I think a lot of people talk about how marriages fall apart without ever explaining how beautiful they were when they started. And if I skip that part, none of the rest of it makes sense. When Thomas asked me to marry him, we were standing on the porch of his parents' house after a Sunday dinner that had gone on 3 hours longer than it was supposed to. It wasn't planned. He told me later he hadn't even had a ring yet, that the question just came out of him like something that couldn't wait anymore. He was nervous, stumbling over the words, his ears going red the way they always did when he was embarrassed. I said yes before he finished asking. We were happy. I want to say that clearly because it is true and it matters. We were genuinely happy. Thomas was the kind of man who remembered small things. Not just birthdays. Anyone can remember birthdays. But small things. The particular brand of tea I liked. The fact that I always needed 5 more minutes in the morning before I was ready to talk to anyone. The way I hated eating the last piece of anything because I felt guilty, even if nobody else wanted it. He knew all of it without being asked. He cooked dinner on Sunday evenings. He brought home flowers for no reason at all. Usually sunflowers, which are not the most romantic flower in the world but were always my favorite. He would look at me across a room full of people and smile just slightly. The kind of smile that means I see you, and I always felt it in my chest. We moved into a small house near the river, white fence, a garden in the back that I tried to grow tomatoes in every summer and never quite managed. I loved that house. I loved the way morning light came through the kitchen window. I loved the sound the floorboards made, even when I used to complain about it. 3 years into our marriage, we had our first child, a boy we named Noah. He came into the world quietly, which turned out to be his personality entirely. Noah was always a still, thoughtful child. He collected rocks. He read books too old for him and asked questions about them that I didn't know how to answer. He watched birds out the window and named every one of them. He is 12 now and still exactly the same. 2 years later, our daughter was born. We named her Anna. She was the opposite of her brother in every possible way. Loud, joyful, always moving, always singing. She sang in the car, in the bath, at the dinner table, sometimes at 3 in the morning when she was supposed to be asleep. She drove me half crazy, and I loved her completely for it. Thomas was a good father. He is still a good father. I want to be clear about that. He coached Noah's school football team one year, even though he hates football. He learned all the words to Anna's favorite songs so he could sing with her in the car. He showed up. For a long time, he was the kind of husband and father you don't fully appreciate until something starts to change. I stayed home with the children while Thomas worked at the insurance firm downtown. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. We had enough. We had dinner together most evenings. On weekends, we drove out to the lake and let the children swim. We ate ice cream on the drive home, and Thomas and I held hands in the front seat, while the kids argued about something in the back. Life was full and warm, and I thought, genuinely believed, that we had built something solid. The change was so slow that I honestly couldn't name the moment it started. Thomas began working later, not dramatically late at first. 30 minutes, then an hour, then more. He said there was pressure at the firm, a new client, a project that needed extra attention. I believed him. Of course I believed him. Why wouldn't I? But slowly, other things changed too. He stopped sitting with us at dinner most evenings, eating quickly at the counter before going back to his laptop. He stopped calling me during the afternoon the way he used to, just to ask how the day was, to say nothing in particular. The Sunday dinners he cooked became less frequent, then stopped. He started looking at me differently. Not badly, that's what made it hard to name. He didn't look at me with anger or coldness. He just stopped looking at me the way he used to. That particular kind of attention, the one that made me feel like I was the most important person in whatever room we were in, it was just gone. Not violently gone, quietly gone. I asked him more than once whether everything was all right. He always said yes, fine, just tired, just work, don't worry. I told myself I was being too sensitive, that marriages go through seasons like everything else, that this was just a difficult winter and spring would come eventually, but winter kept getting colder. One Thursday evening in November, I was putting Thomas's coat away, the dark blue one he'd been wearing all week, and a small paper fell out of the pocket, a hotel receipt. 2 nights. A city about 90 minutes away. The room was registered under Thomas and a name I didn't recognize, Ms. R. Harmon. I stood in the hallway holding that piece of paper until my hands went cold. My mind was doing the particular thing minds do in those moments, running in circles, looking for any other explanation, offering me every possible version of the story that would make this ordinary and harmless. A work conference, a shared booking, a misprint, anything. When Thomas came home that night, I showed him. I didn't shout. I barely even raised my voice. I held out the paper and asked who R. Harmon was. He looked at it for a moment before answering. She's a colleague, he said. It was a business trip. A group of us stayed at the same hotel. They just put it through one booking. His voice was calm. Too calm, maybe. Then why is your name and hers on the receipt? I asked. Just yours and hers. It was an accounting thing. You're reading too much into it. I looked at him for a long moment, and then I said, okay. Not because I believed him, but because Noah was 10 feet away in the living room doing homework, and Anna was upstairs singing to herself, and I didn't know how to break the world open right then with both of my children inside it. I folded the receipt and put it in the drawer of my bedside table. I left it there for 3 weeks, like evidence I was collecting against a case I wasn't ready to bring to trial. The weeks that followed were the strangest kind of painful, not dramatic, just heavy. A constant low weight on the chest, like the beginning of an illness that never quite arrives. I tried to act normal. I cooked dinner, I helped with homework. I smiled at the other parents at school pickup. I laughed at the right moments. I was so good at performing fine that I started to wonder if I was actually fine, if maybe the whole thing was in my head. But at night, when the children were asleep and Thomas was already turned away on his side of the bed, I lay awake and looked at the ceiling and felt the full weight of what I was carrying alone. I cried in the kitchen sometimes, quickly, while the water was running so nobody would hear. I cried in the car before school pickup, then fixed my face in the rearview mirror before the children came out. I became expert at hiding the kind of sadness that doesn't have a name yet because you haven't let yourself fully look at it. Thomas, meanwhile, continued. Late evenings, silences, a phone that was always either in his pocket or face down on the desk. Small disappearances, an errand that took too long, a work call that went until 10. One evening, he came home to find me sitting at the kitchen table doing nothing, just sitting there. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was tired. He nodded and went upstairs. He didn't come back down to check on me. That small thing, the not coming back, lodged itself in me somewhere I couldn't reach. On a Saturday morning in January, I was at the farmer's market when someone said my name. I turned around and saw James Calloway. We had gone to the same secondary school, 20 years ago. I hadn't seen him since a school reunion someone dragged me to about 6 years back. before Anna was born. He looked mostly the same, a little older, a little quieter in the face. Laura? I thought that was you. I smiled. James? Hi. He asked how I was, and I started to say fine. The word was right there, automatic, ready, but something stopped it. Maybe because his face was open in a way that felt rare to me right then. Maybe because I was just so tired of saying fine. Honestly, I said, I don't really know. He didn't fill the gap with noise the way most people do when you say something they don't expect. He just nodded, like that was a valid answer. If you ever want to talk to someone, he said, I mean it. I'm around. I nodded and we went our separate ways. But on the drive home, I thought about those words more than I should have. Not because I wanted anything from James. I barely knew him anymore. I thought about them because they were the first genuinely kind thing anyone had directed at me in longer than I could measure. And that, I think, is the saddest part of what I want to tell you. Not the big dramatic moments, but the small ones. The moment when a near stranger's simple kindness is enough to make you cry in your car because you can't remember the last time someone in your own home looked at you like you mattered. A few days after the farmer's market, I saw James again. It was a Tuesday afternoon and I had just dropped Anna at her music lesson. I had 40 minutes to fill and nowhere particular to be, so I walked into the small cafe on Birchwood Street that I used to love before the children came along and made sitting quietly in cafes feel like a distant memory. He was already there, at a table near the window, reading something on his phone. He looked up when I walked in, and his face did that open, easy thing again. And he waved me over without making it feel like an obligation. We talked for almost an hour. Nothing heavy, not that first time. The town, what had changed since school, his work as a landscape architect, my children, the tomatoes I kept failing to grow in the back garden. He laughed at the tomato story. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind. I found myself talking more than I had in months, not because James was remarkable, or because something romantic was happening between us, but simply because he was listening. Actually listening, the way people do when they're genuinely interested, and not just waiting for their turn to speak. I had forgotten what that felt like. I left the cafe feeling lighter than I had in a long time, and immediately felt guilty about feeling lighter, which probably tells you everything about where my head was during those months. We started meeting occasionally, once a week, sometimes less. Always somewhere ordinary. The cafe on Birchwood, the park near the library, once a long walk along the river path when the weather was unexpectedly good for February. We never talked about Thomas. I never told James what was happening at home. We just talked about everything else, and somehow that was enough. I started to remember small things about myself that had gone quiet, that I found architecture genuinely interesting, that I used to read novels and had stopped somewhere along the way without noticing, that I could be funny when I wasn't exhausted and invisible. I started sleeping a little better. I started looking at myself in the mirror again instead of past myself. Then one evening, Thomas came home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen making dinner, and I had left my phone on the counter. I didn't think anything of it. James had sent a message that afternoon. Just a simple thing. A photo of a bird he'd seen on the river path that looked exactly like the kind Noah would want to know the name of. Nothing else. Thomas picked up my phone to move it, and he saw the name. And he saw enough of the message to go very still in the way that people go still when something has hit them somewhere important. He put the phone down carefully. He asked who James was. His voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. I told him the truth. An old school friend. Someone I'd been having coffee with. Someone who listened. Thomas looked at me for a long moment and then asked, with a strange, controlled quietness, whether there was something I wanted to tell him. I looked right back at him and said, I needed someone to talk to, Thomas. You stopped being that person a long time ago. I don't know when, exactly, but you did." He didn't answer. He walked to the living room and sat down, and I heard nothing from that room for nearly half an hour. When he came back to the kitchen, his eyes were red. Not from anger, I realized, from something else. He said he was sorry, not the automatic kind of sorry people say to end a conversation. He said it slowly, like he was feeling the weight of it as it came out. He said he didn't know I had been so alone inside our life. I told him that was exactly the problem, that he hadn't known because he hadn't looked. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and for the first time in what felt like years, he actually looked at me, not through me, not past me, at me. His hands were flat on the table, and he said he still loved me, and I wanted to believe that. I genuinely did. But my heart was so tired by then that wanting to believe something and actually being able to feel it are two very different things. I nodded. I didn't cry. I just nodded. And we sat there in the quiet of our kitchen while the dinner I'd been making went cold on the stove. And neither of us quite knew what to do with the truth that had finally come into the room. In the weeks that followed, Thomas tried. I want to be honest about that because it matters. He did try. He started coming home for dinner. He asked me how my day was and waited for the actual answer instead of moving on before I'd finished speaking. He sat with Noah during homework and learned all of Anna's songs the way he used to when she was small. He was gentler, quieter in a different way than before. Before he had been quiet like a door closing, and now he was quiet like someone choosing their words carefully because they understood the words mattered. One Sunday morning, he asked if I wanted to walk with him down by the river. We hadn't walked anywhere together, just the two of us, in years. I said yes, because saying no felt like giving up on something I wasn't sure I was ready to give up on yet. The sky was pale blue, and the river was that particular gray-silver it goes in early spring. And there were families out with dogs and children on bikes. All of it ordinary and alive. Thomas walked beside me with his hands in his jacket pockets, and after a while, he said that he missed this, that he missed us. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. He reached over and took my hand, slowly, like he was asking permission. I didn't pull away. His hand was warm and familiar and completely strange to me at the same time, which is a terrible thing to feel about your husband's hand after 14 years. He said he had let work take everything, that he had been chasing something at the office, a promotion, a version of himself he thought he needed to become. And he had looked up one day and realized he had traded everything that actually mattered for something that didn't satisfy him at all. He said he was wrong. He said it plainly, without excuses wrapped around it. I whispered yes, because that was the only honest thing I had. That evening he cooked dinner for the first time in months, and Anna was beside herself with excitement, dancing around the kitchen, telling everyone that Daddy was cooking. Noah set the table without being asked. We ate together, and Noah told a joke that didn't quite make sense, but made us all laugh anyway. And for one small moment, it felt like something I remembered, warm and whole and ours. But later, when I was alone in the bathroom, I looked at my own face in the mirror and asked myself quietly whether I still loved him. And I stood there for a long time, and the honest answer was that I didn't know. I didn't know, and not knowing frightened me more than any answer would have. One afternoon, Emma came running in from the garden with a drawing she'd made. It was our family, all four of us, stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. She showed it to me with complete seriousness and said, "We are happy, Mummy." I pulled her close and held her and kissed the top of her head and breathed in the smell of her hair, and I waited until she had run back outside before I let myself cry. Later, I asked Noah, carefully, trying to make it sound casual, whether he thought his dad and I were happy. He looked at me with those old eyes of his, this 12-year-old who collected rocks and knew the names of every bird on the river, and he said, "I don't know. You're always kind to each other, but sometimes you both look sad at the same time." He went back to his book. He didn't know he had just described my marriage more accurately than I had managed to in months of trying. I saw James once more, briefly, at the supermarket. He was with his son, a small boy of about 6, who was intensely focused on choosing a cereal. James said hello and asked simply if I was all right. I said I was trying. He said that was enough, and that I was stronger than I probably felt right now. We said goodbye, and I told Thomas that evening that I had seen him. I told him without being asked, because I didn't want anything hidden between us. We had enough of that already. Thomas didn't get angry. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked whether I still thought about James. I told him honestly that I didn't think about James. I thought about how James had made me feel, like I existed, like I was worth listening to. Thomas looked down at his hands and then back up at me and said that he wanted to be the one who made me feel that way, that he understood now that he had stopped, that he wanted to start again. And for the first time in a very long time, I believe that he meant it. He kept his word, and that surprised me more than I expected it to. I think somewhere underneath everything I had quietly decided that people don't really change, that the gestures of someone trying to save a marriage are just gestures, surface things that last 2 weeks before old habits come back and fill in all the same spaces they always occupied. But Thomas kept going. He was home for dinner almost every evening. He asked questions and remembered the answers. He fixed the broken latch on the garden gate that had been irritating me for 8 months. He started leaving small things on the kitchen counter for me to find in the morning. Sometimes a book he'd seen somewhere and thought I'd like. Sometimes a single flower from the garden. Once a new mug because he'd noticed mine had a chip in it, and I kept using it anyway. Nothing dramatic, nothing that was trying too hard. Just the quiet, consistent language of someone paying attention again. I watched him doing all of this, and I felt something complicated that I am still not sure I have the right words for. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of grief, because all of these things he was doing now were things he used to do without thinking, back when our life was easy, and seeing them again made me feel both hopeful and sad at the same time. Hopeful because they were real, sad because I understood now how much I had missed them, how long I had been walking around with that missing feeling and calling it something else, calling it tiredness or adjustment or just the way long marriages go. Noah noticed. He didn't say anything directly, that's not his way, but I caught him watching his father one evening while Thomas helped Anna with a song she was trying to learn for school. Both of them at the piano in the corner of the sitting room, Thomas playing badly and Anna correcting him with complete authority. And Noah had this expression on his face that I can only describe as careful hope. The kind children have when they're not sure yet whether a good thing is going to last. I wanted to tell him it would last. I wasn't sure I could promise that yet. There was a Friday night in March, about 6 weeks after the conversation at the kitchen table, when I woke up at 2 in the morning with a pain in my chest that I couldn't explain. Not sharp exactly, more like a pressure, like something pressing from the inside. I lay there for a few minutes telling myself it was nothing, the way you do when you don't want to make a fuss, but the pressure kept building and I couldn't get a full breath in. And eventually I woke Thomas. He was alert immediately, completely awake in seconds the way he used to be when the children were small and needed something in the night. He looked at me and I saw his face change. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He helped me downstairs and got me into the car and drove to the hospital. And he talked to me the whole way there in a calm, steady voice. And I focused on that voice instead of the pain. At the hospital, they ran tests and monitored me through the night. A chest infection that had gotten worse than I'd realized, the doctor said. Not dangerous, but serious enough to need attention and rest. I was in a bed by the window, and Thomas sat in the chair beside me the entire night. He didn't sleep. I know because every time I opened my eyes, he was there, awake, watching me with an expression I had not seen on his face in years. At one point, in the early hours of the morning, when the ward was very quiet, he reached over and took my hand and held it in both of his. His hands were warm. He said my name very quietly, just my name, and then he said, "Please don't leave me." His voice broke on the last word. There were tears on his face, and he wasn't trying to hide them. I closed my eyes and lay there with my hand inside both of his and thought about all the years. Not just the bad ones, all of them. The porch where he proposed with no ring and red ears. The sunflowers for no reason. The sound of the floorboards. The lake in summer and the children arguing in the back seat and holding hands in the front. The long, slow winter of distance and silence. The receipt in the coat pocket. The kitchen table. All of it. Laid out in the dark behind my closed eyes like a map of somewhere I had lived my whole adult life. When I opened my eyes again, he was still there, still holding my hand. I looked at him properly, in the way I hadn't let myself look at him in a long time. He looked tired and afraid and older than I remembered. And underneath all of that, he looked like someone who was genuinely terrified of losing something he had almost lost without understanding what he was doing. I didn't say anything. He didn't say anything else either. We just stayed like that while the hospital moved quietly around us, and the night turned slowly toward morning. They sent me home the next afternoon with antibiotics and instructions to rest. Thomas made soup and sat with me in the bedroom while I slept, and brought me water and made sure I took the medication at the right times. Anna climbed onto the bed beside me very carefully, trying not to disturb me, and fell asleep with her head on my shoulder. Noah came in later and sat on the chair by the window and read his book out loud to me in a low voice, which he had never done before and which made me feel so loved that I had to look at the ceiling so he wouldn't see my face. I spent the following week resting and thinking. I had nothing else to do but think, which is either a gift or a punishment depending on what you're thinking about. I thought about my life, not the way you do when you're rushing through it in fragments and pieces between tasks, but slowly and fully, the way you can only do when everything stops for a moment and forces you to be still. I thought about who I had been before the children, before the marriage, before I learned to make myself small enough to fit into the space I was given. I thought about the woman James had talked to in the cafe, who laughed at her own tomato failures and knew what she liked to read and had opinions about architecture. I thought about the woman in the hospital who had felt Thomas's hands around hers in the dark and recognized something in them that was still real. I thought about what I actually wanted. Not what I was supposed to want, not what was easiest or what would hurt the fewest people, but what was true for me. And the answer that came back was not simple, which I think is the only honest thing I can tell you. The truth about long marriages is that they are rarely simple, even when they are broken, even when they are being repaired. I loved Thomas. I had not stopped loving him even during the coldest part of the silence between us. But love is not the same as trust, and trust was the thing that had been damaged, slowly and quietly, over years of disappearances and silences, and a receipt in a coat pocket that neither of us had ever fully talked about. Not really, not down to the bottom of it. On a warm evening toward the end of March, I walked alone to the bench by the river where I used to sit when the children were small, and I needed 10 minutes of quiet. The water was that copper color it goes in the last light before sunset. I sat there and watched it move and thought about rivers, about how they keep going regardless of what happens on the banks, about how honest they are. And I thought about what kind of honesty I owed myself now, after everything. I don't have a clean ending to give you. I want to be honest about that too, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve a tidy story. Thomas and I are still together. We are in a different place now than we were, not the easy, warm place of the early years, but something more careful, more deliberate. We talk more than we did. We are kinder to each other than we were in the silent years, and that kindness feels chosen now rather than assumed, which gives it a different weight. Some evenings we sit together after the children have gone to bed, and it feels like something real. Other evenings, I still feel the distance, not as wide as it was, but there, a reminder of how much ground was lost and how slowly ground is recovered. I still ask myself sometimes, on the quiet evenings, whether we will make it all the way back to something I could call whole. And the answer I always come back to is that I don't know, but I have stopped being afraid of not knowing. I think for a long time I confused certainty with safety, and what I understand now is that there is no certain version of any of this. There is only the choice you make each day to be honest about where you are and what you need and who you want to be inside the life you're actually living, not the one you imagined or the one you settled for, but the real one. The one with floorboards that creak and tomatoes that never grow, and children who fall asleep on your shoulder, and a husband who held your hand in the dark when he thought he was losing you. That is the life I have. I don't know yet exactly what I'm going to do with it, but for the first time in a very long time, I am the one deciding.